I remember the night of December 13th, 2020, like it was yesterday. It's one of those moments that etches itself into your memory, not because of anything extraordinary that happened to me personally, but because of the mystery and heartbreak that followed. My name doesn't matter much in this story, but I was one of the many people who became deeply invested in the disappearance of Jason Landry, a 21-year-old college student from Texas State University. His story is one that haunts me, and even now, as I recount it, I can't help but feel a sense of unease and sorrow. It all started with a phone call, not to me, but to Jason's father in the early hours of December 14th. I wasn't there, of course, but I've pieced together the details from what I've read, heard, and imagined. Jason had left his apartment in San Marcos, Texas, at 10:55 p.m. that night. He was heading home to Missouri City, Texas, to spend the holidays with his family. It was supposed to be a routine drive, one that would take about 2.5 hours. But Jason never made it home. At around 2 a.m., Jason's father was awakened by a call from a police officer. The officer informed him that Jason's car had been found crashed and abandoned on a desolate road in Luling, Texas. Luling. That name sticks in my mind because it's not where Jason was supposed to be. Missouri City was his destination, and Luling was in the opposite direction. It didn't make sense. Why was Jason there? What had happened? The officer described the scene. Jason's car had apparently veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The front passenger door was locked, and the keys were still in the ignition. But Jason was nowhere to be found. His clothes, however, were discovered a short distance from the wreck. It was as if he had simply vanished into the cold, dark night. When Jason's father arrived at the scene, he was met with a chilling sight. The car was damaged, but not beyond recognition. The air was thick with the kind of silence that only comes in the dead of night, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The police were there, but they didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. They hadn't even realized that Jason was missing until his father pointed it out. It was up to him to collect Jason's clothes and belongings from the scene and take them to the police station as evidence. Can you imagine? A father, already reeling from the shock of his son's disappearance, having to take charge because the authorities didn't seem to understand the urgency. The weather that night was bitterly cold. I remember hearing reports about it later. Temperatures had dropped significantly, and the wind was biting. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver uncontrollably. And yet, Jason had taken off all his clothes. Why? What could have driven him to do such a thing? Hypothermia can cause people to act irrationally, but the circumstances surrounding his disappearance were so strange, so inexplicable, that it was hard to accept any simple explanation. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Jason intensified. The police conducted a more thorough investigation of the area near the crash site. They found his backpack not far from where his clothes had been discovered. It was a small clue, but it offered little in the way of answers. A larger search operation was launched involving drones, sniffer dogs, and even horses. They scoured the surrounding land, searching abandoned houses and sheds, hoping against hope that they would find some trace of Jason. But despite their efforts, nothing turned up. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. I followed the case closely, reading every article, watching every news segment, and listening to every podcast that covered it. I couldn't help but feel a personal connection to Jason, even though I had never met him. Maybe it was because he was around the same age as my younger brother, or maybe it was because his story was so hauntingly similar to other missing persons cases I had heard about. Whatever the reason, I found myself drawn into the mystery, desperate for answers that never came. Months passed, and still, there was no sign of Jason. The initial flurry of media attention died down, as it always does, but for those who knew him, the pain and uncertainty never faded. His family continued to search, to hope, to pray for his safe return. But as time went on, it became harder and harder to hold on to that hope. I often find myself wondering what really happened that night. Did Jason get lost? Was he disoriented after the crash? Did someone take him? The questions swirl in my mind, but there are no answers. The case remains unsolved, a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly someone can vanish without a trace. Jason Landry's disappearance is a story that stays with you. It's a story of a young man with his whole life ahead of him, a family left in anguish, and a mystery that may never be solved. And as I sit here, recounting it in my own words, I can't help but feel a deep sense of sadness. Sadness for Jason, for his family, and for all the other missing persons whose stories remain untold. This is the case of Jason Landry as I know it, a case that continues to haunt me, and one that I will never forget.